We like to start each of our meetings with, of course, a connect to purpose and our reason why we are here. And that is always first and foremost the donor and their family. So this is the story of Jacob Clayton. Jacob was born in Butte, Montana, and became a donor in Kalispell, Montana. So Jacob was known as by his family as somebody who was a thrill seeker and witty and caring. His mom self-described him as a bit of a troublemaker, but nonetheless was, of course, adored by his family and friends. Jacob was actually not registered, but because of his willingness to give and the type of personality he had when presented with his option after his fentanyl overdose, his family did decide to move forward with organ donation, knowing that that would be a beautiful legacy for him to give. So they were able to, go to the next slide here. They were able to recover Jacob's kidneys, liver, and heart, which went on to save 4 other recipients. And I actually had the pleasure of meeting Jacob's family at the end of April at our Montana Governor's Gift of Life ceremony. Jacob's family was honored with the Governor's Gift of Life Award, and that's a photo of his family on the right with our Lieutenant Governor, Kristen Juris, in Montana. So Jacob is certainly why we do what we do every single day at LifeCenter. Great. Rachel, I will pass over to you, and then I'm going to put myself on mute, but I will share your slides for you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mallory. While she's pulling those up, I just want to thank you all for being here today. I know that your schedules are very busy and that spending time focusing on donation is really something that we appreciate, and we could not do this work without all of your help and all of your colleagues' help. So we'll just quickly kind of review a lot of probably things that are a little bit familiar here at the beginning, but are in the weight objectives and goals. So those are well known to all of you by now. We have 3 of them. The first one being connecting with families, which we'll spend a little bit of time talking today about. And then eliminating early extubations. We all know that if a patient is extubated, they can't be an organ donor. So we want to make sure that we don't have any early extubations prior to being able to speak to the family or honor the patient's donor decisions. And then the third one was honoring donor decisions. And so as you all know, we've been working on these 3 objectives for a couple of years now with good results. And the goal of this End the Wait campaign is to achieve a donation rate of 75% or higher. And if you go to the next slide, Mallory, it really just shows how all 3 of these objectives are interconnected. One does not happen without the other, and all of it requires a lot of collaboration between us and yourselves as the healthcare team, and then all of us with the goal of supporting the families and honoring the donor throughout the entire process. So really what each of these goals work together on is collaborative communication, increasing the donation opportunity. The hope is that with all of these, we actually have better family support than we would have had without them, and then increased hospital satisfaction. It is important for us that the process goes smoothly for all of the parties that are involved in donation day in and day out. So we'll talk a little bit today about connecting with families. This was a newer objective to the End the Wait campaign. The first year that we had it, we just focused on early extubations and honoring donor decisions. And then about a year ago, we added connecting with families. So if you go to the next slide, Mallory, it shows a little bit about the work that we collectively did as a group last year and into this year on connecting with families. One of the things, as you all probably know, I shared it broadly last year, is many families would tell us when we talked to them, you know, if you had only talked to me sooner, if you had talked to me yesterday, I would have said yes, or this is absolutely something we would have wanted. We just didn't know that it would take so long. So we're ready to make the decision now. So last fall, we actually started implementing a process for what we're calling initial donation consults. And I like to kind of take this at a higher level, which is we just want to make sure we're talking to the families at the right time and the right time for them. And each family is unique. As we all know, each case is unique. So the right time for one family might not be the right time for the other. So this is really collectively working with the healthcare team to do a pretty detailed assessment of where that family is in terms of their understanding of the fact that this patient is not going to survive. And so what we're seeing is that our authorization rates with the IDCs, so those that happen earlier in the process than historically we have talked to families are seeing a higher authorization rate. So the authorization rate with IDCs is 76%, and authorization rate with no IDC is 54%. And what this data is showing us, or what we believe it's showing us, is that when we actually talk to families at the right time for them, they are more inclined to save a life through donation. Public surveys give us that information that most people, given the opportunity, would want to save a life. That's on an average Tuesday afternoon, but we're not meeting families at that average Tuesday afternoon. We're meeting them at the worst day of their lives. So we're trying to get them the information with enough advance notice where they can incorporate that into their processing and their planning for end of life. And we are really seeing good results. And what we're also finding, based on just a lot of review, is that even if families end up declining for donation, they often feel better served by being talked to at the right time. They have more opportunity to digest the information, to ask additional questions, and to make the right decision for them. It's also exceptionally helpful in those registered patients. So you can see the difference on the DCD registered patients, which, as we all know, has been part of our recent push on honoring donor decisions, that the authorization rate with an IDC is 91% as compared to 78%. So most families with the right information and the fact that the loved one had already made that decision, when they aren't pressed for time, it's much easier for them to say yes. So I wanted to share that information before we pass it to Dr. Suter, because as I've talked about, it's very much a collaborative effort with the healthcare team to determine when is that right time. And certainly the physician and the nursing staff have a huge impact in our ability to, really thread that needle and make sure that we're talking to the family at the right time. So I'll pass it to you, Dr. Suter, to share some comments on how the healthcare team can maybe support this work.
Sure. Let me just try and share my content here. And for one of the reasons I'm not Teams savvy when it comes to meetings there, given that we do most of our stuff on either Zoom or, but it doesn't seem to be letting me do it. Mallory, I'd sent you just a link. Don't know, can you see it?
Not.
No, shoot. Well, I try not to be a talking head, but maybe I will just have to be a talking head on this time and just talk to the points there anyway. So, and I apologize everybody, but I guess many of you here will share the perception that I do, is that end of life that we approach when we're dealing with in the ICU all too routinely is not an on or off situation. It's a process. And so our discussions on prognosis, mortality, and end of life are things that we best manage incrementally. In other words, we don't try and give everything on day 7, when it comes to an ultimate timeline. We build on conversations that we start on day 1 when somebody comes in. And so doing that incrementally adds to the patient and family's understandings at regular intervals there. And that pacing avoids us overloading families with information there, whilst offering still reassurance that necessary care is being delivered, and we're continuing to get further information into what's the right thing to do and what possible outcomes may be ahead of us down the road. But presenting options on organ donation, as Rachel has talked about there, at the appropriate time in that pathway will help avoid being locked into timescales and expectations that can frustrate our subsequent discussions there. But in order for that to work, I think communication is key. There has to be open dialogue between the healthcare team and the OPO in both directions. The healthcare team will often consider the possibility of progression to end-of-life care, and they can do that without compromising their current therapeutic plan. I mean, I'll look at a patient who comes in who's got a bad intraparenchymal hemorrhage, and I'll think, okay, well, they may not do very well here. But for the time being, we're going to keep on with an active therapeutic plan here, bearing in mind that there's a possibility that there may be a progression to that end of life situation. And what I guess we're trying to kind of put across here is that similarly, consideration of donation should be an implicit component of that possibility. It doesn't have to be an explicit focus within our ongoing treatment strategy, but it's just something that we have to bundle together. It's if I'm considering end of life care, then I have to consider donation at the same time. Now, the other side of the communication is that the OPO will help the healthcare team immeasurably by being able to communicate back on referrals made. And that allows the messaging of either interest or, conversely, non-candidacy for donation should progression to end-of-life care actually kind of take place there. And our ideal scenario is sensitive messaging by healthcare team on the gravity of illness and condition that goes on, like I said, from admission, that day one. And you talk to the families straight off and you keep them updated at regular intervals there. And in that ideal scenario, we would want to have communication that there are options in the direction of care that may become relevant, which might include that end of life care and consideration of organ donation, taken together as a composite, like I said, but without commitment to timescales. And we continue to offer that reassurance that necessary care is being delivered and stability is a key goal. Now, the OPO reviews our case records in this ideal scenario, determines eligibility, feeds back to the healthcare team. Yes, there's interest here in that. And then the appropriate time that we can proceed to that initial donation mentioned there with the LifeCenter, utilizing such available triggers, and donation can be mentioned as an attendant component of end-of-life care without actually requesting authorization at that point. So when they do opt for end-of-life care, the OPO can actually make a seamless approach, building in the content of earlier messaging. And that's the ideal, but all we know that hospitals are busy places, lots of moving parts, lots of potential for things going wrong. And where I see things going wrong on a relatively frequent basis, even in my own place, is just that our healthcare teams can commit to a plan and a time prematurely, starting as early as the ED. And that fuels expectations by family on completion of a process and steps to be taken. And when you've had the worst news ever, there's sudden change in a plan that you thought you heard earlier on, and now is being changed into something else, is part of that contributory stress, which I think adds to the kind of the overload and difficulties that families face at that time. Other places that can go wrong is where the healthcare team can make erroneous assumptions on the thoughts and inclination of the family to either end-of-life care or donation or both. And that could include misperceptions of timing, necessary family presence. I think failing to make a distinction between grieving and the consideration of donation, and we see families report those as two separate things, and we see those as two separate things, but it's often a human frailty to actually conflate those two together. And then the necessity of spiritual support may be required again as well, but we may not truly understand those things. There can also be significant misconceptions on the appropriateness of donation, as in terms of the organ viability or the feasible timescale of an OPO response. How soon can we get there? And so people make those, arrive at those misconceptions, and they make their own judgments in that situation, which can often lead, go down a road that we'd rather not take. So ways to approach this is, how can we build a framework? Hospitals vary in their patient demographics, staffing, or organizational attributes and patient care flow. If you've seen one ICU, you've seen one ICU. There are similarities, but in different institutions, but there are very specific differences again as well that need to be thought of. And so those individually specific, situations demand perhaps individually specific approaches. Bearing in mind, though, that there are commonalities and lessons that can be adapted to fit. And some of those commonalities and lessons can include policies on prognostication. How do you prognosticate? What should you mention at what times? Having healthcare team huddles prior to family meetings to include and kind of involve the OPO input at those stages. Having policies on end-of-life consideration. Having an inclusion of OPO in the CQI process bidirectionally, being able to feed back to the OPO when things haven't gone well, but also having the OPO being able to kind of raise CQI points when there's been those early extubations that we're concerned about. And those are just some of the things we've included at RBV, for example. And then I think it's important as well that there be some degree of aftercare and review of end-of-life support and decision-making. And that can help build that framework along with that. So rather than me kind of, chattering on about those things, Christian, I think I'd like to turn to you all. When considering the patient destined for end-of-life care, what barriers or impediments do you see in your own environments that may not necessarily translate to my experience, but what do you see in your own environments that might arise and offer resistance to the consideration of donation? How can we anticipate and plan for these? And how can our overall process be monitored, appraised, and evolved with that? Bearing in mind that you always want to be in that continuous cycle of quality improvement. But I'm just going to throw it out there, and please, I'd love to hear from you all just on what your thoughts and experiences are, and what do you see arising in your own place, bearing in mind the continuum of the patient experience from the ED to the ICU. What can arise and offer resistance there to actually being able to consider donation?
I'll throw one out just because it's low-hanging fruit that I see all the time, Dr. Suter, and that is that families may be interested in donation, but either they'll reply that their loved one never wanted to be on long-term ventilatory support, or they're concerned about patient suffering. I think that's something that's often expressed to the care team that we see and is a barrier to donation.
This is Kelly. I'll throw something else out that I think we end up seeing people who are, they're an extremist when they come to the ICU, and then we're full court press with everything, and then they have some discussions, and they're like, okay, we're gonna stop this, but then it moves very, very quickly. Like they're like, we want this to happen right now. We're ready. We've made the decision. And they want it to happen yesterday. So some of those decisions, or the fact that we've actually been coding them and then they kind of declare themselves. We've definitely had a couple of those things just in the last 2 months where and we don't talk about donation, right? Like, so we're not having that discussion with them. So it's not like we are finding out whether or not it's something they want, because we don't have the discussion with them. So ours is all around the actual care that's happening in the moment, as opposed to anything kind of donation related. It's all about what's happening with the patient in the moment, be it coding, be it putting lines in, be it moving to a comfort care. I think if it's a normal comfort care scenario where it's moving over time and it's moving, relatively slowly over time, those are a lot easier than the ones where it's a very rapid decline. I'd say we have more troubles with that.
So thank you for that. And just to kind of be a little bit curious there. I completely agree. There's not a lot you can do about the self-declared situation where somebody's coding in front of you, and if you can achieve any stability, it's maybe relatively short-lived. But in that setting, say where there was something that was fairly swiftly, easily correctable, and you've been able to kind of get control and arrhythmia, get people sorted out, and they are relatively stable. Going back to the first question that you addressed, which was one where the family's just been under stress, and now it's okay, now we're done. We just need to be done with that. To what degree do you think that we as healthcare providers are also complicit in this? Because we love to give timescales to families sometimes, and just saying, okay, well, this is the way it's going to be. Is this for the next, the next 48, 72 hours would be crucial, to employ a hackneyed term, but that the media loves. But nonetheless, it has a grounding in truth there, and we do use these time periods to evolve prognoses and diagnoses, and but presenting the options that will be presented to people at those junctures of time when we've decided, is something that I don't think should necessarily exclude donation at that time point. But to go back to clarify what I was saying, to what degree do you think that we are, perhaps mentioning to people too early on, oh, well, we'll do this for such and such a time, and by this time, if you're ready, then we'll just move, we'll move to end of life care, without necessarily including the option of donation?
Well, I'll only speak for the ones that I'm aware of. I don't think that's something we are so focused on wanting people to donate here. Do we always get it right? Absolutely not. But we're a transplant center, so it's just fundamental that we want people to donate. So I think that when these things happen, it's not ever purposeful.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I would never assume it was. Assuming maximal good intentions, is the way I tried to approach most things there with that. But it can start very often when I find sometimes these conversations there, because this is a process, and because I can't be involved over every element of this process. I do sometimes pick up things where the mention of a timeline has already happened. Like just going back to the ED example. So a well-meaning person, the ED, says, oh yeah, we'll see how they do in the next 48, 72 hours. But after that, if things aren't good, then it's not going to be a good outcome. And that's not an unusual type of scenario with that. And so to what degree do you think we can identify possible intervention points like that and try and nullify or anticipate, any of these impediments or barriers to donation that come up?
I'm wondering if there's any time constraints that units are feeling as far as moving patients along or the progression of patient care. Is that an issue that any of you are seeing?
I don't know that the constraint is necessarily from that end. I think, and from us, I think communication is a big process. I don't know that we get a lot of prognostication formally, Dr. Suter, in the way that you're mentioning. I think maybe the informal prognostication is a little bit more on the team's communication process, but it has been integral for us at Swedish to be able to establish early referral criteria so that we refer early, so that, because what matters to me as a human being and as a nurse is that when we have the point of decision that is, okay, let's schedule a family conference for tomorrow, it would be optimal that the family come into that family conference with all the options already given to them themselves. They would come in with the option of, okay, we knew we're having a family conference today. LifeCenter Northwest talked to us yesterday. This patient has, again, for Swedish, we have a ton, we don't do trauma, but we have a ton of really terrible subarachnoid hemorrhage patients and really terrible head bleeds and really tragic strokes and cerebral edema, swelling, and all that stuff, herniation, everything. We know tomorrow we're going to schedule, we've had our early referral, patients already been referred to LifeCenter. For us to be able to make sure that we are in communication with LifeCenter so that we have the opportunity to be able to say, we know, LifeCenter reaching out and following up, and for us to be able to also communicate that we have a family conference plan for tomorrow. This is going to be a family that possibly it would be great for an IDC to happen early, so that when they come to the family conference, they bring it up. And we don't risk bringing it up, first of all, and we don't risk having the conversation of, okay, well, this isn't going as you thought. They don't want to be on life support. You want to withdraw today. It's been 2 weeks. You're really exhausted. Let's withdraw today. And then we're 9 miles down the path already, and we miss the fork. That's natural and not awkward, because then you're at the point of now somebody comes in and brings up donation again. or now for the first time when we just had the conversation. And this happens, you guys all know that, brings up donation after we just had a conversation about withdrawing life support today. And I think that's our big opportunity for improvement, is that communication piece, so we don't miss that.
Yeah, no, I thank you. I like that. I like the fact that it touches upon what I was trying to get at earlier about really approaching end of life and donation as a kind of composite entity there. If we see one coming up, we've got to be prepared for the other to arise at the same time. Well, of course, there always has to be the end of life for the nation, but you understand what I'm saying. And so it's just having that kind of flow of decision making kind of well sorted out and anticipated in advance. Now, as you said, things can come up and derail that, and I think expectations being altered too late in the day that have already been developed are the things that often frustrate that kind of process. But so yeah, I'm kind of please. So what kind of triggers do you think can be identified by the healthcare team to enable that early, hey, LifeCenter, you'd better go in and actually have that IDC because we think this family's heading in that kind of way? Do we do that on the basis of, there's a decline of condition where we anticipate that there's going to be a discussion with the family, and we know we're going to arrange an end of life meeting with them? We just haven't settled on the agenda completely as yet, or we rely on the input of the nurse in the room who's talking to the families and developing a much better insight into where they're thinking, where their thoughts are in all of this, or all the above.
I mean, I think there's an all the above component to it. I'm sorry. Kimberly, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there's an all the above component. I don't know that we're in a place professionally in critical care at all nursing wise where the nursing staff are in a place to know that this is a possibility. Everybody's so new, and for the next 2 to 3 years, everybody's first time doing this is going to be their first time. Or having a patient, this isn't, we just have we travelers and turnover. I mean, that's true for everybody in the region specifically, but I think something to think about for that is to be able to have a little bit more of a concrete trigger. That is the plan of something like a family conference, knowing that a family conference is happening, for that to be part of the trigger process, because not always will the clinical staff have the experience to maybe advocate for that or feel comfortable or appropriate. That's just my 2 cents. Sorry about that. I apologize for.
Not a problem. And this is Kimberly with Astria Topanish. And something that we specifically face with our population is that the education piece. So not all of our patients' family have really much idea about what goes on for organ donation. So what we've tried to do in the last year is pushing not only just the donation itself, but letting them know that that's a possibility, and giving them the heads up, giving LifeCenter the heads up that, this family has no idea about organ donation, has no idea about medical information. Can you guys work this out? Can you start this sooner so that it gives them more time for that processing? Because we have had a lot of patients that just did not understand, and give them more time to comprehend what this all meant.
That's an interesting thought. So basically, you're affecting really, you're calibrating the conversation that you need to have, and you're adjusting the resources accordingly with regards to the amount of time people are set up for and expecting. So yeah, okay.
I think what Michelle outlined was like the perfect scenario for what we've been trying to implement with these IDCs of, knowing where the family's going. I think historically LifeCenter is sort of elevated, like what's the clinical course of the patient? Like that's what we've been most concerned about, right? Are they a potential donor? And then there's now with what we're calling the family readiness assessment is actually elevates what's the family's course. And so they're on equal playing field of both the clinical course and the family. And both of those are kind of driving towards an outcome. And so I think what Michelle described is that idea of like us being very collaborative with the healthcare team on both fronts to figure out when is the right time for us to take the fork in the road, which you described. And I'm wondering from your perspective around the more concrete triggers, I mean, we have what we call the family readiness assessment that our staff are asking every day around the family. Are they understanding grave prognosis? Is there a care conference scheduled? Have they had a palliative care consult, or is one being requested? So trying to get at those timing issues of like, okay, this is moving in a particular direction. So I wonder if we could come up with what are some of those readiness assessments that we could put as triggers for the healthcare team to also be aware of when you all see them happening, you can also alert us versus, we're calling and checking in once or twice a day, but we're not there for the 12 hours in between. So I don't know, that might be an option as well.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from some of the other clinicians there again as well. But I think that one of the adjustments we have to make is to think about things contextually, and by that I mean, what are the expectations for the family on this patient, and where are they likely perhaps to move to an end of life decision? And that threshold varies considerably, and it can be affected by things like cultural background, their degree of, what their religious beliefs are, et cetera, as to, and what kind of, how active, a lifestyle did they lead? How valuable was their independence to them? And these are all things which can lead to significant variation between one's patient and family and another patient and family. And so to some degree, you have to kind of calibrate all your subsequent flow of care in the light of those initial conversations that you actually have with a family day one. We don't often perhaps ask all the questions that we should be doing in day one about what kind of person are they, how, what kind of lifestyle do they lead, how important is their independent functioning to them. But having those kind of questions be sought for and answered might actually help then to be able to put either somebody's failure to improve or deterioration from their admission point into the context of saying this, they're going one way or another here that may push towards an end of life care decision. But yeah, I'm interested in what other clinicians are thinking.
I think ideally that would be something we would always do. This is find out who the person is. And I do think that lots of clinicians do to the best of their ability, but many times the clinical care sort of becomes front and center, and that comes a little bit later. It isn't, I don't know that there's any way to sort of get around that, because so much of the time from an ICU standpoint is that everybody is so focused on saving them that it's not that it's not important. It comes after the saving part.
Does it have to?
I think that it's all hands on deck so much of the time. I don't think it's not that anybody thinks it's less than, it's just that everybody is working very quickly for the common goal of really saving them. It depends on your patient, right? I mean, it's not somebody that's coming in through the ED and, their sepsis, they're a certain age, but we're talking about your rapid responses from the acute care, your patients that are coming in a thrash. It just often doesn't take the primary role. But I think everybody would agree that it is an important aspect. Absolutely.
Kelly, I wonder, I've sat in on the multidisciplinary rounds at Montlake, and I've seen a number of different scenarios taken into consideration proactively from, do we need a social work consult, or do we need to get dietitians in to see them based on how the course of care is going? And I think to Dr. Suter's point, I'm wondering, can both things be true? Can there be a scenario where you're all hands on deck and life saving, but you're also going, I mean, I've heard how the patients, they know plenty about sort of where they think the patient could go, but they're still trying to do everything. But they're also thinking proactively about, well, maybe we need them to talk to the family about where we go next. And this is in all directions of the continuum of care. It could be when they're getting better and we need to move them off the unit. I'm curious if you think that would be possible.
I apologize that last part you kind of cut out a little bit, but just so
sorry.
I'm gonna recap it and make sure I kind of understood what you're saying. So what you're
Sure.
saying is that at that moment we could be like, not necessarily in the moment where you've got 5 people in there trying to save them, but are you saying getting LifeCenter at that point, somebody stepping away and saying, talk to LifeCenter, have LifeCenter step in at that space? Is that what you're meaning?
I'm thinking, like, how do we look proactively as care continues, knowing that proactively we can be both saving a patient's life, or at least attempting to save their life, but also knowing that other scenarios and realities could present themselves. So in the same way that you're thinking about having social work be a consult soon for this patient in the next 24 hours, maybe we're thinking like, oh, this normal family readiness assessment question that LifeCenter uses is happening right now. We should probably loop them in and see if this is the right time to speak to the family, or at least conversation or a plan.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would change. I think we'd have to change process, and it would be a cultural change. That's what I think. I think that anytime that patient is coming in like that, everybody's thinking, where's the end game here? Is the end game going to look like this, or is it going to look like the patient that we work with LifeCenter? Whether they address it at that moment, it's definitely not happening. That would be a total culture change, I think, for them to put that on that list that's in the first primary things that they're doing. Is it impossible? I don't think it's impossible, but it would be a culture change.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, this is anecdotally, I'd have to look at the data more, but I think a large amount of our missed referrals, for example, some of them are absolutely patients who come in and are extubated in the emergency department, but most are patients that are stabilized, moved to the ICU, put on hypothermia protocol, care conferences are scheduled. And I think that's where it's sort of like, how do we incorporate the proactive sort of thought process into how the unit works and collaborates with LifeCenter in the same way that you would consult other specialties. How do you consult LifeCenter and bring us into the conversation in those moments in that scenario? And how do we think about those family readiness assessments for this conversation when the time starts being appropriate, of course?
I would be interested to hear from other areas if you feel like that would that be a cultural change for your units? Am I unique in this? Am I ICUs?
No,
Kelly, hey, I don't think you're unique at all. I think that'll be also a challenge for Harborview itself. I think it's, these patients come in severely injured and traumatic event, and they're heading towards extremis, and you have all hands on deck. And sometimes our barrier is, hey, we hope the ED did the early consultation with the LifeCenter Northwest team, and sometimes we find it's challenging. Our charge nurses don't have the free time to pull in the group. Hey, let's get this consult going right away. It will definitely be a cultural change. That's not impossible, but it is something similar here at Harborview, Kelly. So
And we talk about it every day in rounds in the ICUs at Swedish. It's built into our multidisciplinary rounding process as well to talk about if consult was done, if it was completed. And even in that situation, still with our staff and direct patient caregivers, physicians, advanced practice providers, nurses, respiratory therapists, the conversation still is a little bit reminding, and it is still the need to kind of follow up of, we did have a referral, we're talking about family care conference, and I think, scheduling it, have we called them back? Has LifeCenter, I mean, that's what I find myself asking in rounds. Has LifeCenter Northwest called you back? Have you been in contact with a rep? Is anybody following? Do we need to recall them from that standpoint? And that is just a culture change. And it's new. It's still, I just want to highlight too, that it's new for everybody, that for us clinically in leadership positions, we have had these conversations a lot. And we do have these a lot, and we know where our data is and we get all of that information. But for those people, nurses at the bedside, it always is something they haven't needed to follow up on before. That's been my pattern for the last 3 years. During this whole process it seems like it's always new for somebody to think about it or to work it into their mindsets. It's just not on their radar.
Is everyone else, hi, this is Bevan. Is everyone else receiving their consultations or their collaborations with LifeCenter Northwest over the phone, or are there some areas that are serviced by an individual in the department, in the unit?
Ours are mostly over the phone, the initial family consults, unless they're coming to request or talk about formal donation.
What is that? I mean, I honestly, I feel like in our department anyways, that has sometimes been a barrier to phones being thrown across the room. Like, I don't want to talk about this right now kind of situation, no matter how much we've, had the appropriate conversations of, when we find family members in this situation, we, have to take these next steps. I mean, it certainly, well, number one, it makes it difficult for me to know, like, to be a part of that conversation that they're having on the phone. And then also, it does feel a little technical, I guess. I'm not sure what the right word is there.
I mean, I can speak to our challenges. A lot of times what we are finding with these initial donation consults is they are happening over the phone, because sometimes families are ready, or many times, even though it's the right time to talk to the family may not be at the hospital. They may be planning to travel to the hospital to withdraw support, like tomorrow or something like that. So it actually, in consultation with the healthcare team, seems like today is the right time to have the conversation. So a lot of these do happen over the phone. Some of them happen in person. And it kind of depends on if we anticipate the conversation is going to happen or if it sort of is a surprise. That's kind of what happens. I think in terms of the question you have around like families throwing things across the room or not wanting to take the call. We've done, I want to say, close to 250 of these IDCs now since September. So obviously our early data was a very small number. And we've had probably, I think, 4 to 5 where the families have been upset that it was too early and we, missed something that we shouldn't have talk to them as early as we did. Early on, there were a couple, which I think we missed, like one of the things that Dr. Suter mentioned is cultural considerations, which early on, we did not, I think, take that into account. So we had a couple of families where that was an issue, which we now have a pause in our conversation and preparation for an IDC of what should we be taking into account. And there are actually patients on our board right now that we're following that are declared brain dead, registered donors that we have not yet talked to because we know that that family is not ready to hear the information. So we try to be very judicious in terms of, making sure that we're getting all that information so that we don't run into that scenario where the family would be upset. And for the vast majority of them, that has not happened. And anytime that it does happen, then we take a step back to try to figure out what did we miss? What could we do better? How could we better serve this family, whether that's in person or on the phone?
Well, and I was just going to add too, I think our goal is to try and meet the family in the best place at the best time and ideally in person. And whenever we can do that, that's what we're trying to do. And I think that's sort of what I was getting at with my questions to Kelly and the rest of you guys about, like, how do we identify these potential opportunities for even the IDC earlier? Even if we don't have it right away, how do we start talking about it earlier so that we can plan logistically to be in Fairbanks or to be at UW Montlake or wherever? At the end of the day, like, as much as being in person is a high priority for us, I also think that, as you saw in the data that Rachel shared, whether we're in person or not, families overwhelmingly appreciate that we're meeting them where they're at the right time. And timing seems to be a lot more important than the medium, even though it doesn't feel good to the eye test or the feelings test that we have in the moment. And I know it probably stresses the healthcare team out more too, that we're not in person. So I do want to acknowledge that, but I think that's our goal. And that's sort of where I was going with the proactive sort of thought process, is like, how do we incorporate this and weave it in so that we can be more proactive when possible? It's not always going to be, but.
I know we're getting pretty close to time. I don't know if you have any final comments, Dr. Suter, and then Mallory, I know you've been kind of watching for potential action items. Maybe you could, I don't know, Dr. Suter, if you have anything you want to add, or Mallory, and then Mallory can maybe review what we have, if anything.
I think we're all agreed that, it's a good thing trying to, talk to the families at an appropriately early time. It's just making that decision as to kind of, when is the right time. You've talked about, the patient, the family readiness indicator, etc., and we've got the patient clinical conditions. But like I said earlier, and I was intrigued by some of the comments that have come up just on, what triggers can we use, and but some of that is still so contextual based on that patient. And yeah, it can be an incredibly busy time when we're trying to save the life of that patient, trying to save, improve their outcomes when they're coming in through the door. But at the same time, our families spend a lot of time in waiting rooms, and they spend a lot of times waiting for us or waiting to come in and see a situation when we may have a possibility to determine, what we know of that patient, develop our understanding of what their expectations would likely be for recovery and prognosis and what matters to them, and whether there's anything there that we could use in terms of the early development of our sense of who that patient is and, what might push them towards an end of life conversation at that early stage. So I think that's something that we could, think about, come back to, at least from my perspective, but yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Suter.
I kind of figured this would be a bulk of the conversation. So I did take some notes, which I'll of course send out and share with you all, but just please make sure that what I have captured here accurately reflects the ideas that you shared. And if not, I can certainly adjust it. We talked about building a framework that supports commonalities and differences across ICUs. Some of the ideas included the CQI process and huddles, rounding, etc. Some existing barriers that you all had mentioned was families deciding to stop and wanting the process stopped right then and there, so very quick end of life decisions. Discussion around the use of timelines specifically provided by physicians. Sharing of the early referral process so that when families come into goals of care meetings, they know all of the options, including donation, and families can be the ones to bring that up to the healthcare team. On the kind of flip side of that, there's the challenge of having a lot of new nurses in the workforce as well as travelers, and them not always being aware of or recognizing when these conversations are taking place. Additionally, there's an opportunity for improvement on educating donor families on the donation process and what they should expect, so they can mentally process. Discussion around the phone versus in-person IDCs and data around that. And then the value of appropriate timing and showing the validity of the conversation, so approaching family the best time versus the mechanism on which we approach them. So those are big topics. I think we could probably spend a meeting on each of those topics, if I'm being honest, which we will certainly use to kind of help guide our next meeting, and which will take place likely in August. So I will certainly get all these meeting minutes together. I will get the recording processed as well, and we will share this with all of you. If you see anything in the minutes or something came up that you really want to make sure we share, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. That is certainly what I'm here for, to help support. We do have a few things we didn't quite get to, so there will be a few updates in the email as well of just resources we've created that are available to you as part of this End the Wait advisory group. And lastly, I will be sending out a doodle poll to try to identify our August meeting date. There's a potential I will be out on maternity leave by that point, so that invite may be coming from either Justin or Rachel as well. So, but I do want to thank you, Dr. Suter, for joining us. It's always fascinating to hear your conversations on many different levels. And of course, Rachel, the IDC information as well has been really valuable. And thanks for everybody for joining us. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.